right, we should start. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this evening's lecture by Sarah Dunn. Sarah is an advanced studio professor this semester at the school and also a founding partner of the Chicago-based practice UrbanLab, together with Martin Felsen. And most importantly, perhaps, Sarah also received both her BA, majoring in architecture, and her MArch from Columbia. UrbanLab is a research-based architecture and urban design practice who, quote, strive to respond to the complexity, growth, and unintended consequences of the modern city by developing a catalogue of architectural, infrastructural, and urban design strategies, often by hybridizing architecture, landscape, and infrastructure, and always designing with an intention to leverage projects with cultural qualities. Their projects span scales. Their seminal project, Growing Water, was an investigation into ways to channel street water runoff back into the Great Lakes, while simultaneously weaving a system of linear parks throughout the city. It was the 2007 national winner of the History Channel's City of the Future competition for proposal for Chicago, and Sarah and Martin have continued to mine the project for their work, continuing the large-scale research and incorporating elements of it into even their smallest projects, including urban plazas in Chicago that channel water and function as mini pieces of a possible citywide infrastructure, with those all-important cultural qualities they mention in their mission statement. At the smaller scale, Sarah and Martin have built a number of beautiful, fascinating, and experimental houses where walls move to expose views and transform interiors. Materials are transformed as well, rusting or becoming perforated to create patterns of lights and shadow. Their projects seem to always be in motion, and their website explodes this by focusing not on text or images, but on a series of short video clips. No house is more beautiful or homey than their own house built on Chicago's South Side that intertwines life with their daughter, with their life together with their office, and combines work and living and nature and gritty urban recycling in an amazing whole. In 2009, UrbanLab won the AIA College of Fellows La Trobe Prize, and in 2010, they were included in the Emerging Voices lecture series at the Architecture League here in New York. In 2012, they were finalists for the PS1 MoMA competition. And currently, Sarah is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago, as well as a co-director of Archworks, an alternative design school in Chicago, where students work in multidisciplinary teams with nonprofit partners to create design solutions for social and environmental concerns. This mirrors the most impressive aspect of their practice, the presumption that possibilities for design innovation arise out of the investigation of an engagement with the world around us, a world that embraces the various constraints of infrastructural and ecological systems to create new forms of cultural desires. Please welcome Sarah Dunn.
Thank you. Thank you, Amal, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for... Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, sorry. For coming. I'm really pleased to be back here after 20-plus years from graduating from GSAPP. I don't think it was called GSAPP exactly when I was here, so I'm getting used to the GSAPP part. But I thought that since it was about 20 years ago that I was here, I would start with what I was doing at 22, right before I came to GSAPP to start my MArch work. So that was the time of Shumi, so just before I started. I worked as the lowest intern at Stephen Hull's office, like really the lowest. I was responsible for inking almost every drawing in this book, Edge of a City, 6 days a week, not designing every drawing, just inking every drawing. And you don't ink anymore, but it was a fine art. 6 days a week, all day, every day, I drew every road in Dallas-Fort Worth, and in Phoenix, and in Cleveland, and New York also. And what's interesting about inking drawings is that it's copying. It's lots and lots of copying. It's kind of Zen, but it's sort of deep copying, and maybe internalizing. I'm hoping that I was also internalizing what I was drawing. Because looking back, I realized that during my hours and hours of drawing, I'd become very interested in exactly what the book was about, architecture and the city. The projects in Edge of the City leverage the organization of the city, program, and form to create new architectural form and new ways to live in those forms. Looking back, I realized that Stephen was really interested in combating sprawl with these new forms. And I'm currently working on my own book with my colleagues at UrbanLab, in which we also speculate on what is possible for architecture in the city. We do it with ideas of hybridizing and leveraging and thickening. And we're producing a set of projects that we hope question the assumptions and expand what's possible for the city. So tonight I'll show you some of those projects, and then I'll awkwardly transition into built work. So each project begins with a question like, what if a building could stop sprawl while creating new possible lifestyles in the city? And maybe this is the most directly connected to Stephen's work, because it does deal with sprawl. So each project starts there. And for example, the United Center project is one which is dealing with sprawl. It's a stadium, an existing stadium on Chicago's west side that hosts winter sports in Chicago, hockey and basketball. And over the years it's grown, not it so much as the parking and the void space around it have grown. So this is 1938, 1970, 1995. The parking and the void space are really growing at this point. And in 2011. And so the official parking is affecting the value of the adjacent parcels of land and creating more void in the sort of cycle of parking and void, more void, property values kind of depreciating because of adjacent void. But the parking is a necessary program for the stadium. And so we asked ourselves, what could happen to do how could we stop the expansion of void while leaving the parking? And how could we also leverage that for new public amenity or public space within the city? So we came up with this idea of a reverse growth boundary, a kind of growth boundary for parking, but a kind of new edge for the city to fill in too. We encircle the official parking and then hope that by doing this, the neighborhood will fill back in. In order to inhabit the boundary, we looked at a typical Chicago typology, which is the 3-flat. We played with it, we stacked it, we carved it, and we invented a catalog of new 3-flats that we could deploy along our growth boundary for different effects and different programs and different densities around the zone. So here's the existing condition with the site and a lot of void. There's the parking with our growth boundary delineating it, extruded, and then the 3-flats deployed. The project's not really a wall now, but a series of gateways that allow passage through while still giving identity to the United Center precinct and still allowing for porosity. It's kind of more of a sponge. The difference between this slide and this slide is the neighborhood we're imagining would fill in and densify and organically. We wouldn't design that part. And then since the United Center is a winter sports stadium, and we've created this precinct, a very specific area, we thought, what can you do in the summer? This growth boundary could actually be animated by temporary programs within the zone. For example, in the summer, it could be the city's largest temporary farm. or its largest campground, or its largest temporary pool. And so that's sort of how we very quickly approach our projects when we're speculating and asking what if, and then playing out the scenario to its end to answer the then. So another question we asked ourselves, and this is the project that Amal mentioned in the introduction, Growing Water. What if a city's streets were leveraged to create a new street park network? And then what if that network hosted a series of new building hybrids? So Growing Water starts with the grid of the city and the fact that the city, Chicago, sits on the shores of Lake Michigan, which is 20% of the Earth's surface fresh water is on deposit in Lake Michigan, and 95% of the United States surface fresh water is there. Chicagoans regularly take out more than 1 billion gallons of water every day, actually closer to 2 billion. And yet, Chicagoans put back into the lake less than 1% of that water after they've used it. Every other city in the Great Lakes takes water out, uses it, puts it back. And why is Chicago different? And what could a design proposal possibly do to remedy this situation? Well, the city sits on the border of 2 watersheds, the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed. And water that falls on the right side of this border, which is actually a slight ridge, would naturally flow toward Lake Michigan, and water that lands on the left side of this image would naturally flow to the Mississippi. But 100 years ago, Chicago decided to cut the watershed boundary and connect the 2 watersheds and reverse the Chicago River. The city did this because the city was dumping its wastewater into the rivers, which were flowing into the lake, which is where it was getting its fresh water. So it seemed like a really good idea at the time to reverse the rivers and send Chicago sewage to St. Louis. So then St. Louis started to sue Chicago and hasn't stopped since. Another thing to know about Chicago is, like most of midwestern and western cities, it's laid out on a grid. And the east-west streets happen to align perfectly with the gravitational flow from the ridge to the lake. The red line indicates the subcontinental divide between the 2 watersheds. So the east-west streets flow down. So this is the current water situation in Chicago on the left. It's an open loop, and those of you who are interested in ecological issues know that loops aren't supposed to be open usually. They're meant to be closed. So we thought about how would we actually close the loop, the water loop in Chicago, but leverage the infrastructure to do that for new public space. We propose to redesign every street every half mile from each other to collect stormwater and wastewater and use gravity to allow that water to be percolated or drawn back to the lake. And the eco-boulevards, as we call them, would run through the city according to the network of the city, making connections with parks, and there is a kind of emerald park system, and there's a lakefront system, so it would basically turn a couple of existing networks and standalone parks into a huge park network, and every inhabitant would therefore only be 1/4 mile from a park. The streets that were turned into eco-boulevards would be hybridized to accommodate ecological and cultural programs. These represent patches of ecological and cultural programs that are, the ecological programs collect stormwater, basically they're wetlands. The cultural programs are things like markets and playgrounds and recreational fields. This would be a really souped up street where all the parking is gone and very little street is left, but this is only a most extreme example. You see that we would also hook into existing vacant spaces, of which there are many in Chicago, and existing park surfaces. And then perhaps in those areas where there was a little bit more space, architecture could emerge. In places where the ratio of, the street to park ratio would depend on the location and density of the surrounding neighborhood. So if it was a super dense neighborhood, there would be less park space. And in order to do this, we also thought about how to clean the wastewater, because if you replumb Chicago, you have to do stormwater and wastewater. And so we came up with a catalog of little ecosystem water treatment plants, which would be distributed throughout the city and clean wastewater passively, saving energy, because it costs a lot of energy and money to move water around the city. Currently, it's moved to the largest water treatment plant in the United States, which is in the suburbs of Chicago. It takes a lot of energy to do that. But at the same time, these new neighborhood infrastructures could be double programmed to introduce socially oriented programming in the neighborhoods. We looked at how much wastewater is generated by individuals and groups and figured out that we would want to treat basically 1 or 2 blocks of typical Chicago density, which is less dense than Queens. It's not really that dense. And how many of these little plants we would need throughout the neighborhoods. Each blue dot is a ecosystem plant. This is how it currently is, where all the water is collected and moved together to this giant water treatment plant. The technology to clean wastewater in this way is currently available and in use, and it's based on the natural way of cleaning water with plants, microorganisms, invertebrates, and fish. We looked at how to pack these the cells that are needed to clean the water, and came up with these layouts, the ones that are in color, and then designed for a typical neighborhood condition of Chicago. And we'd plug these in. They take the equivalent of 2 parking spaces. And we propose always that every treatment plant should be double programmed depending on its location and the neighborhood desires. For example, this one is a bus shelter with a bus lookout that for when your bus just doesn't come, which happens a lot in Chicago. This is a bike station. We have our version of City Bike. It's called Divvy Bike. So this could be a city divvy. A food kiosk. A recycling center. And maybe most extravagantly, the water that's cleaned by the little eco plant can be leveraged to provide clean water for a neighborhood pool. And so in each moment of the project, we're really trying to think about how we can hybridize and leverage form, program, and infrastructure in order to create new possible lifestyles. So right now you can't go to the corner and go swimming in Chicago, but maybe you could, and maybe you should. We started to think about, we got kind of obsessed by water, and we started to think about other ways to leverage infrastructure and hybridize it to solve issues like flooding, and could we create new public space from that in Chicago? We seem to have 100-year rainstorms really frequently, more frequently than every 100 years in Chicago. And even a typical rainstorm, not a 100-year rain, causes, in many cases, flooding to happen in Chicago. And this is, again, because of the infrastructural moves that were done 100 years ago, when we connected the 2 watersheds and reversed the Chicago rivers. All stormwater overflow goes into the rivers, and then when it has nowhere else to go, it needs to go into these giant holding tanks that the city is building. This one's being built in the suburbs, and It is impressive, but it's monofunctional and therefore completely uninteresting for us. So we propose that perhaps a different tact would be interesting, that we could unreverse the Chicago River, use it to catch stormwater and hold it, and then filter it through these filter islands that we are proposing that would also separate the two watersheds again. If we dam, so we're proposing to dam the rivers, separate the watersheds, and use these new pieces of large-scale ecological/cultural program to clean water and also make new social space. So it's a hybrid of landscape, a landscape of water cleaning and new public space, and it happens at the lakefront in this case. So the Chicago River is coming in at the top, and, well, actually used to come in at the top. Right now it flows the other way. This is, you may know, the 1909 Daniel Burnham Plan of Chicago, where he proposed that architects would actually design infrastructure, public space, and the lake edge, and how that happened in Chicago was, well, it mostly didn't happen, but this is one moment where it did happen. And he is probably our best case of example for how architects, or sort of precedent for architects getting involved with designing infrastructure and public space at the city scale. Our project riffs on his formal logic, as you can see. Water is cleaned through a series of landscapes. It's most dirty at the north and most clean at the south. And at the south, it finally runs out into the lake. We devised a series of patches, we call them, a spectrum of ecologically based, the greens and the teals, to more socially based, which are the pinks and the purples, which also have embedded in them architectural form and surface. And we arranged them from sort of where we need most cleaning, there would be more ecological patches, and where we need less cleaning, more cultural patches, so those are mostly on the south. And this is a zoom of several patches coming together. Pathways meander between. Zooming out to the whole. So you can see Ferris wheels and play fields and playgrounds and sandboxes and amphitheaters, as well as different types of wetlands. And so the island during a rainstorm, and you see the stormwater is being processed through the landscape. It's more dirty at the north and more clean at the south. And then after the rain, this is how it is in its sort of non-rain event version. So it changes. After presenting projects to the city and the mayor a couple of times, we realized that there's one magic word for them, and that's jobs. So we started actually thinking, could architecture actually engage in this discussion of, can architecture somehow be a catalyst for economic growth? And so we started thinking about, what if infrastructure was hybridized with manufacturing program to create public space? And we called this project Free Water District. The idea begins at the same place as the Growing Water Project, with the fact that the Great Lakes have a lot of water, and that soon, or maybe even now, that water is more valuable than oil, and oil is responsible for millions of jobs water could be as well. If the Great Lakes is the Saudi Arabia of water, then we should be able to leverage that natural resource for new possibilities for the region. In the last decade, the Great Lakes region, the Rust Belt, has lost at least 2 million jobs. So this project thinks about creating a free water district, free for certain types of programs. They're like tax-free zones, they're free water zones. There's precedent in other economies. For example, in Iceland, they have an abundance of clean geothermal energy, and so this has attracted very many energy-intensive industries to Iceland. And so we thought, what if Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, all these Rust Belt cities set up free water districts that could attract water-intensive industries? We proposed a certain number of rules, but pretty simple rules, that you would take what you need, use it. The wastewater that's produced in your process you would be required to clean it in a bio machine, which is a kind of bigger version of the ones that I've already showed. Remediate it further in wetlands, send it back in a biostreet, which is basically an eco boulevard, and put it back into the lake. And at the same time, take responsibility for cleaning the post-industrial landscape that dots the whole Great Lakes region. This is a typical condition. There are so many post-industrial wastelands in this region, and parks we can't make a park in every single one of them at a certain point. Other things need to happen. And so what you see here is neighborhoods of people who are looking for jobs, railroads, highways, canals, factories that are still surviving, the lake or one of the lakes, and the edge of the lake. The free water district would be organized into this situation. It would, as I said, start with a kind of a bio street, or series of biostreets, which would be the main conduits for taking water out and putting water back into the lake. The middle zone would be a landscape and architectural intervention that would do, amongst other things, flood control. Flood control would be part of the system because we would want to try to be completely offline from the neighbor city's infrastructure. So we would not have a combined sewer and rain and stormwater system. It also becomes a landscape for recreation, and underneath it, a landscape for all sorts of NIMBY programs that people need but don't want. So along the edge, recycling, all the half circles are recycling that would take the waste from the neighboring factories and repurpose it and try to keep it on site, as well as parking and stadia and clubs and things that make a lot of noise, car washes. And into and above this thick urbanism, we proposed either an R&D university or something that would then sort of be a catalyst with the corporate headquarters and factory buildings that would surround this area and work in a kind of academic loop with them. This is that center zone in a flood. The factories and corporations would aggregate around, and then each free water district would be somewhat a result of its situation. So it looks like this little running robot guy here, but it might look different somewhere else. But we would always try to make it kind of look like a little running robot guy. We would imagine that these free water districts would eventually have impact inland and into the hinterlands of the Great Lakes region. As resources flow back and forth, it would affect the hinterland. And this, then, we really always trying to think about what are the new architectural forms and what are the program mixes that might be possible with when we set this whole what if up, and what lifestyles might be produced from this mixing. So we look really into the sections and try really to think about what would be possible. So the factory is on the left, and then there's a bio street. There's the recycling coming up next. Above is the R&D University. On the surface is park program and recreation. Underneath is other factories and car washes and a giant library. Above is a farm, and here's a auditorium. A club or a disco connects to the university student center above, and then a very loud stadium, which somehow makes sense with academic offices above. A drive-in movie theater, more recycling at the edge, which connects to the factories, and another bio street, and then the neighborhood beyond. We were invited to present the project at the 2012 Venice Biennale, so we made a giant model in which we looked at very specifically at the formal and programmatic possibilities of the project further. So this is cutting through a section of the R&D University with a stadium on the left and a disco on the right, and the kind of way you get up into the university. The university could have could be both kind of, it could have dorms potentially, although mostly there's no living in the zone. These are just more images of the model. And here's the road that rings the center zone, and the factories to the left, and the recycling half mound to the right. Looking at what does it feel like to be in the landscape and near the landscape. And then Mayor Daley retired. So we started looking somewhere else. We started looking to the southwest. We got tired of so much water being plentiful, and we thought we should look at places where there's no water, but the weather's really awesome. So we started thinking about what are the possibilities of these cities and these landscapes. We started to think about what would happen if you built a new aqueduct in the desert and created new LA and Vegas lifestyles in the desert. Everybody wants to live there, but there's really no water. And we thought about Death Valley. Death Valley is one of a number of natural depressions, sinks, and valleys that exist in the world. And these are all lower than sea level. It had water in it many years ago. Our project is a little bit outrageous, maybe really outrageous, but it's just a thought experiment. We propose to flood Death Valley. And the reason we're doing that is because, if you read the newspapers, the Southwest is more and more desirable to live in, but there's less and less water. Aquifers are being tapped. Desalination is the next step. So we thought, and it's already happening, we thought, what happens if you actually build an aqueduct where you take water, seawater, and transport it through the desert to Death Valley, and along the way, you don't just build an aqueduct. It wouldn't even be the longest aqueduct in the world. These are some pipelines and aqueducts, famous and infamous. The one in red on the right in the United States is the Keystone. However, it would be maybe different than every other aqueduct that's being constructed right now, and because it would leverage the aqueduct to create new architectural form and many new possible lifestyles along it. In its most basic form, it is an aqueduct that crosses the landscape without interrupting the landscape too much. Plant species and animal species can pass by and through it, and also it can pass over man-made infrastructures and settlements. And this is what it would look like underneath in its typical condition. But then this is what it might look like on top, and the beginnings of new desert lifestyles, which we could imagine. We looked at a variety of scales. We looked at a kind of a city density, and it's sort of not really a city, but a city in a building. So in my studio, we're doing a lot of thinking about wall buildings and mound buildings and map buildings, and we have one of each here. This is the wall building. It's vertical aggregation of program and form, and in the middle, a kind of new social space that we don't think exists right now in the cities around, which is a kind of a shaded social space. This is kind of a drawing of it. It changes sectionally as you cut through it. The organization is residential above and certain cultural programs above, and then below commercial and aqueduct. The aggregations change because the types of the elements that are kind of collaged together are changing. So we looked at a variety of housing types and commercial types that we would then kind of aggregate together along the aqueduct to see what was possible. We also thought really a lot about the kind of space in between and how we could modulate the form above and below in order to get difference within it. So whereas, we're very influenced by megastructure projects from the 50s and 60s, but we're trying to go a slightly different way and introduce difference, figure and form and site specificity into that sort of thinking in order to see what's possible. So we developed a number of housing types that aggregate together in order to make difference along the project, and different types of lifestyles would be possible within them. There's rental, there's hotel, there's condo, there's assisted living. So there's the part of the typical residential floor above and the commercial the social public space below. Because of the nature of the climate, different types of strategies of sun shading and facade would be necessary. So that's the south facade. This is the north facade. And then what we're most interested in is the public space in between. So here's a pool, playing fields, hanging out spaces, and then the sort of aggregation as it's moving through, as it's not moving, as it's there, it doesn't move. We also looked at a town density. And here we thought, what types of public space could we invent by playing a kind of a zoning game? Here it's a kind of a mound or a mountain building, a kind of an aggregation that appears mountain-like. And what we thought here was that we would propose to build lot line to lot line. So we're not inventing kind of not really new political structures, but just slight zoning tweaks. So because it's the desert, you would get your light and air from courtyards, which could help you shade your space. We're really interested in this kind of contiguous or continuous public space. So the idea would be that as a lot owner, you would build to connect to whoever was next to their public space. So public space would become a continuous but differentiated surface above different types of residential ways to live, all courtyard based. And then when you mix those together, you might get this series of this catalog of potentials where the blue is the public space, below is commercial, and above is residential. And it somewhat starts to aggregate like this. So it might grow like this. It doesn't have to all get built at the same time. We thought about the quality of the mound, and then mostly also about this idea of the public space within it. This is a typical plan cut at the level of the aqueduct public space, but then this is a plan of all the public space. So it's a plan that kind of goes like that. And a zoom of it. And then the kinds of spaces that might emerge from that. And since it's in the desert, we're particularly concerned with making different light modulations so that different types of programs would be comfortable without the use of too much air conditioning in the space. And we also looked at a suburban density. We thought about what happens when you aggregate housing program with aquaculture and agriculture, and looked at programs, researched agriculture and aquaculture that can work with a spectrum of brackish to clean water. These are the aquacultures that we looked at, and then we sort of mashed them together with different types of mat buildings that could provide shade for the aquaculture, and at the same time provide different types of living and working conditions for that upper level. So if you live in the mud crab house, it's different than living in the chicken yard house, which is different than living in the orchard house or the goat house. And these all kind of tuned in order to provide a certain amount of shade or functionality for the aquaculture program. And then aggregated together, it becomes a kind of very large mat building, or the feeling of one. The lower level on the left and the upper level on the right. And then this is the site plan and a model of the different houses. This is the shrimp pen house and the goat house, and you get some Swedish people too. And then finally, on top of the aqueduct, a herd of goats, and how it might look from above. So those are all ideas of, we think, new possible lifestyles. But at the same time as we're generating those, we're also thinking about and doing and making at a much smaller scale. This is a project that we call Live Plus Work. It's our own studio and house. We built it when we didn't have any clients as a demonstration project that we could build. The site was, on the site was an existing grocery store that was condemned by the city. And we looked at recycling it, rescuing it, but it was too far gone. So we demolished it and recycled the demo into a hill, which is the second tallest hill in our neighborhood. And we rebuilt the FAR, but we reorganized it. And since the property is on a street that's commercially zoned, there's a rule that you can't live on the ground floor, but there's no rule that you can't build your landscape up to your second floor. There's no rules about landscape in Chicago because it's very flat, and they don't know how to do hills, so we built a hill. And that really transformed how we live and work in the space. So all of a sudden we have these new exterior spaces which are sort of defined by the mound and the work zone, and how we live in the apartment, which has a direct connection to the landscape. The spaces are really simply organized, but we hope that the result is somewhat complex. The materiality depends on its location. So this slide on the left is a little bit dark, but it's a Core-10 facade at street level that's perforated to allow light in, but kind of keeps a kind of hard edge to the street. There's a certain amount of veiling and transparency that emerges from this, and you can see in the middle of the slide some green circles. You're actually seeing right through the building there, and you're seeing those circles on the right, on the hill. So there's, even though it's a hard facade, there's some transparency. And then the rest of the space is aluminum facades, either flat or corrugated, and glass. The mound is a kind of work in progress. The second floor is effectively a bridge, so it spans 2 columns in the front, 2 columns in the back. And so we get these trusses that span from the 2 columns on one side to the 2 columns in another. And we designed the trusses to respond to the interior program adjacent, so they don't actually exist in the exterior wall, they exist sort of 2 feet in. And so we propose straight members where you might need more access, and diagonal members where you don't. So for example, in front, diagonal members in front of a window and straight in front of the kitchen or a closet. And that's what it kind of looks like with the, we have a garage door in the living room. Just because we pretend that we live in LA when it's nice. Here's a bookshelf. And this actually recently won an AIA honor award, so we're happy about that. After we built that, we built the X house, which is interesting for us because it is on the edge of 2 landscapes, a woodlands landscape and a prairie landscape. And we were being a little bit literal, and we thought we need to really want to build at the intersection of these 2 ecologies, and we had a very limited budget. So we built a very simple volume and carved the center in order to take advantage of the 2 landscapes and kind of connect through the building the 2 landscapes. In a funny way, we always called this the public space of the project, and the 2 sides, the dark spaces, the private areas of the project. So the 2 side pieces are on the left, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. On the right, master bedroom and bath and kitchen and mudroom. And those are have different sort of requirements for public and extroversion. They're more introverted and more private, so we deal with them differently, which allows us this kind of feeling of a carved space. This is a section through the living room, and this is a little diagram that we made to figure it out. This is it unfolded, and this is it built. So you see right through the project from, we're standing in the woodlands area, looking at the prairie side. And the space on the right you see through the perforated and corrugated aluminum is the master bedroom. You see this is sort of right at the edge of the prairie and woodlands, and how it is to kind of live in that space. We were really interested in taking the diagram really seriously and hiding the side private spaces with secret sliding doors in the main space, between the main space and in this case, the master. And then on the outside, where we designed the series of sliding panels which veil the private interior spaces, do light modulation, privacy, and are operable by the inhabitants. And so there's the difference between the kind of extrovert side and the introvert side. And the light qualities that happen from all of this veiling are really interesting to us, and we kind of keep coming back to this, and we'll see this maybe in another project very soon. We recently are finishing this project, a 10,000 square foot vegan food processing plant. It has the actual food processing, the company offices, a public cafe, a yoga studio, and an apartment for the owner, his girlfriend, and 2 dogs. And that's a lot in kind of a little space, and a really insanely low budget. So we looked at precast concrete as a way to kind of instantly get both a quick construction and have a kind of final surface that was acceptable to not have to add anything more than what it was. So we start with a really, this is the dumbest diagram ever. That's it. We raised part of the building up and get from that space new spaces. The other thing to know is that from as high up as you can get in the site, you have this really beautiful elevational view of downtown Chicago. So by raising up, we allow a space for the public cafe on the ground floor and a new, a kind of nice apartment for the owners on the upper level. So this is the cafe that slips into that space below. And this is the apartment kind of in really big snowstorm above. And you can see the view. And we made these kind of angles to take advantage of different views. Sort of as you're in one space, you might be sort of focused on another, a different view than if you're in an adjacent space. The deck, the living room. How do you live kind of next to that really big wall of sort of punched openings? So this is those are the 2 spaces that we kind of leverage out of that really dumb move. But then the kind of interiors of the rest of the project are really different from that. They're more inward looking. They have secrets of how to make gluten into meat replacement, so can't give those away. This is the one of the offices, and this is in the main manufacturing part. And so it is modest, but just the shift, I think, maybe makes it somewhat interesting, and it also becomes a kind of background for other things to happen. So this is an artist, Gabriel Spector, who installed a giant painting on the north side of the building. And so all of that sort of work in 10,000 square feet to get all that program shoehorned in, we were then commissioned to design almost the same size house, for a family of 5 in Chicago. The black and white house, which is 8,000 square feet, not including the garage and deck. So it's enormous on a 50 by 125 foot lot. And so we immediately thought about ways to kind of modulate or reduce the building's monumentality. And so we've performed a series of subtractions in order to do so. We cut out a courtyard on the 3rd floor. We cut off the back of the building. We punched openings, but then we also made one addition, and that is to add a kind of hill that would connect and make a continuous landscape from the basement up to the top of the garage. So then we get this. We also looked at the scale of the actual kind of material of the building, which is brick, and attempted to play with like removing brick or protruding brick in order to modify the severity of the building. And it's still monumental, but we're hoping that it's more fun than it would have been if we hadn't done all of that to it. The effect of the protruding and the missing brick is interesting. And we also fade the brick, so it goes from protruding to flat as you turn the corner. And this is the courtyard that's cut out of the third floor. Eventually it will be, this is kind of looking at the plantings that are not quite taking, and it's going to get replanted, and it will be eventually a lush courtyard. We looked at dematerializing even on the interior. And so this is the stair, perforated steel, and it's really dematerialized, and maybe too much if you're afraid of heights. So it's that way, 3 floors. In the back, the window, the sliding doors slide completely out of the way in order to, again, try to demonumentalize the building. And the reason we were hired, actually, is because we've become little mound or hill experts, and they saw our hill and wanted one for their kids. So we have this landscape that goes from the garage roof all the way to the basement, which kind of changes from grass and concrete steps to flat to sod and up, and then they've just planted bulbs in it as well, and then to a playing field on the top. And so finally, I'll close with one more project. The Lax House that we're finishing up construction on in Los Angeles. It's for an artist and a writer and their child. It's located in Echo Park, and it has 2 really important views. One is the Angeles National Forest, which is really, really beautiful. And the other is the Hollywood sign, which is either super cheesy or not, depending on your opinion of LA. And I really love LA, so I always, when we were designing the project, kept checking that we would actually get to see it. I can report that it's mostly visible, although there is a tree on another hill a little distance away that I might have to trim in the middle of the night. So the concept or the diagram for the project is the site is very steep, and according to the neighbors, they thought it was unbuildable. The land had changed hands over 20 years, with multiple projects being proposed and none built. And meanwhile, the LA hillside ordinance is getting more and more strict. So we decided to peel, and then as our kind of obsession with kind of private and public, introduce a kind of private space under the peel, which is the bedrooms and studio, and below carve a little further and make a kind of inside-outside lifestyle. Here's the model, which we try to adhere very strictly to. This is the living space, which is really defined by the excavation of the hill and the upper level. And this is the rendering of the project. The facade on the second level is operable. The construction is mostly complete. This is the garage, which doubles as a gallery and studio. And this is walking up the stair. The facade is not done. Don't look at it. It needs its veil. This is the ground floor. The living floor. You can see it's really defined by the kind of excavation of the hill. The stair we had welded and dragged up the hill in one piece and installed. This is someone going down the stair. And so what we're working on now is completing the prototyping for the facade. We have one facade prototype complete, and we're working on the next one as well as the gate for down below. Oh, this is the second. This is we also copy ourselves. We did this bathroom almost identically in Chicago, and now we're doing it again in LA. This is the existing master bedroom, and then this is a rendering of when the skin is open and when it will be closed. And so this will add a layer of privacy and sun shading while still allowing for view. These are some drawings that we've made in order to figure it out. This is for a simple window, a single window, and a double window. And so this is what it will look like. This is one of the prototypes that we've made. And so now we're waiting for the facade. Thank you.
Response will be given by Galia Solomonov and Nahin Huang. Thank you, Sarah.
It's incredibly powerful work. It's beautiful to see. I think that when you described the project, described the lecture in the beginning, Sarah, you said that there was going to be this difficult transition between the large-scale work and the most intimate work or the build work. I do not see a break. I see a total continuity. I think that there is a very deliberate use of geometry, a very strict and deliberate use of geometry in both projects that kind of takes these, sometimes when you see architecture, you kind of need to know what ideas were in the person's mind, but in your case, the mechanism in which you operate in the landscape and in the geometry of volumes is very deliberate. You can see move 1, move 2, move 3, and that carries through, doesn't pause or doesn't diminish when you go into a smaller project. It remains very strong. And the other thing that I see throughout is a kind of very personal, refined pop sensibility, almost like, I would say, if I had to qualify that, I would say almost Japanese understanding of pop, very dry, kind of humorous, and a little bit, very materially, where it's like you work with nature, but at the same time, when you use geometry, it's always in contrast. Your mounds are not to be mistaken by accidental mounds. They are constructed, and they are like really intertwined with the geometry. And so that this kind of, there is a very deliberate and personal use of landscape, geometry, and pop, art pop, whether you gravitate to certain artists or certain artists gravitate towards you. I can see that there is a color and form that follows throughout. Mm-hmm. And so my question is about lifestyles. Mm-hmm. You mentioned several times throughout the lecture the idea of creating lifestyle, and I have seen that phrase used in media, in kind of television shows and things like that, but I haven't heard that applied to urbanism, or not quite in the way that you use it. And at the same time, you're coupling this kind of light idea of lifestyle with a very demanding infrastructural change. And so my question is like, can you talk about lifestyle? Like, is there projects that have changed lifestyles, or yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think that lifestyle, maybe, and creating new ways to be in architecture or in the city is something that we're really interested in. I'm maybe really interested in. My partner's kind of interested in it. He's more interested in the tech, I think. But I think it's really interesting the only reason to hybridize, I think the only reason to hybridize things that you find in the city that are sort of mono-program or mono-functional, to hybridize them into something else is toward cultural effects. And so I call those lifestyles because cultural effects sounds weird. But I guess, I mean, we're affected by infrastructural decisions every day that we take for granted, that living in a single family home in a suburb of New Jersey is, I mean, that's, you don't even talk about that as a lifestyle. It's just so ingrained as a possibility, but that's a lifestyle that's driven by infrastructure, economy, politics, and was designed by architects. So that maybe that is one lifestyle, which I think is interesting, but I think there are lots of other ways that we can refigure the city that give us possibilities that we might not have thought about yet, but that could be really interesting, or maybe just allow what's already there to be even more interesting. So, for example, the possibility of living and working in the same or close spaces. It's usually not allowed in many American cities. With a kind of small zoning change, then a whole new set of lifestyles emerge. So it could either be it could be a policy change, an infrastructure change, an architecture change. Because we're architects, we always think about design and architecture and how that could get leveraged. But yeah, that's that's why we're interested in lifestyle, or why we call it lifestyle.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of great insight. I think how the form actually achieves the lifestyle or promotes that lifestyle in your project is really kind of moving, almost, I would say. And how the aesthetic, in a way, becomes something that makes the kind of or achieves the legibility of the urban agenda. I think that's really striking and interesting to me. Maybe one other thing that I would like to kind of discuss is related to influences. So at the beginning you talked about how your work with Stephen Hall on the project of Edge of a City really affected your thinking a lot in terms of how one needs to really think about architecture and city together, and how you might think about city through architecture and architecture through the city. So I think that's really actually shows in your project very strongly. But I think it could be my fantasy, but I think the other big influence that I could kind of observe is the kind of conditions of Chicago, or maybe a history or legacy of Chicago. So as we all know, I don't know, and then you also kind of refer to those, so Burnham, and then, of course there's Mies and Wright, and, Tigerman and Hilbersheimer, and all this kind of, I guess, very weighted precedents out there. But also the geography of Chicago, I think in a way kind of gives you a unique setup for the work. From outsider's point of view, where really kind of, I don't know, let's say loaded infrastructure network, and that's very expanded, is meeting the opportunity for kind of very strong architectural expressions as a three-dimensional object. So I think that actually kind of a lot of your work actually, I think, plays with that influences. So I think one question from that would be, what are some of the most kind of, I don't know, influential historical figure or conditions that affects your work the most? But from there, maybe what could be more interesting discussion, I think, is how different cities affects your work. Because at one point, after the mayor stepped down, you moved aside into the West, and then that gave you whole, I think, very similar goal of combining public space and infrastructural kind of aspirations or necessity, but gave you a whole different set of kind of requirements and also form and kind of scales in a way. And then I heard that your studio this semester at GSAPP in China, and I also imagine that also prompts a different set of inspirations and different set of discussions, and the conditions in developmental city, I think, probably is very different from the things that you dealt with in the American context. So I think it will be interesting to kind of hear from you about those things.
Well, I think when we decided to set up our practice in Chicago, we thought neither one of us is from Chicago, and we thought there would be a lot of freedom there, which there is in certain ways. We thought, with its history of building, that it would be really easy to build. And it's not as easy as we thought, but there's a certain freedom, especially on the south side, where nobody's paying attention, and you can do stuff, or you can propose stuff. And it's at a point where what's interesting to do the studio in Beijing is you imagine that Chicago was like Beijing 100 years ago when it was the hog butcher to the world, and importing and exporting lots and lots of things, and manufacturing through the 70s, which was still pretty strong. Now it's at a different moment, and so there's certain freedoms that come with a city that's kind of the post city has certain freedoms, and it's interesting to take ideas that we have had for Chicago and think about them in Beijing as a way to perhaps propose different ways that development or settlement happens. So it has been very interesting to look at both cities, a kind of city on the make and a city kind of post, and how the two are related and how they're different. In terms of, Chicago's freedom and history, even the taxi drivers know who Mies van der Rohe is. It's really amazing. But it's a bit stuck in the past, in that, they know who Mies van der Rohe is, and then that's it. They don't know who anybody else is. And I do imagine, though, that Chicago will eventually take on a new character that's possibly related to its old character. I don't know how that will happen, but in the meantime, we have used it as a kind of giant thought experiment. And before the mayor retired, some of those ideas were actually being implemented at smaller scales and different scales, and maybe not so obviously, but we were hopeful. But we'll see. We also were interested to kind of think outside of that kind of outside of Chicago and Chicagoisms.
Is there any question from the audience, from you guys, that Yes.
The saltwater aqueduct out in the Death Valley, is the aqueduct project something that's feasible, or is it just purely speculative and too costly and doesn't have a chance?
Well, I think it could happen somewhere. Probably, I think it could happen. I think that our idea is that that we do the project. We do the project in a very serious way and work out the tech as much as we as architects can work out the tech.
I think you just simply should say the Romans did it. Why can't we not? Why not? Of course, it can be done.
It can be done. Aqueducts and pipelines are being built much longer and maybe much more controversial all over the world. And the water situation is really, really dire there. And our opinion is, if you're going to think big and see what happens. But it is possible. Yes. And it would be great.
Amal?
Two questions that may be related. Can you talk about tech versus lifestyle on the one hand, and then the question of visual representation, drawing the prevalence of the axonometric, and a kind of, I guess, maybe resistance to tech, or...
It's my personal resistance to tech.
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
No, so if my partner Martin had given this lecture, it would have been completely different. It would have been a lot of tech, a lot of like water and water cleaning and stuff like that. Once we gave a lecture in front of, this is terrible. Are you still recording? Can you stop recording? We gave a lecture in front of Stanley Tigerman, and Martin started, and Stanley went to sleep, and because he was talking about all this tech. And then I got up and started talking about, not tech, and he woke up. So I learned then that maybe not so much tech is good. But that's the way we have organized our practice, and what I'm interested in and what Martin's interested in are slightly different. We have, So I like to talk about the formal qualities and figure and field, and he does too, but he's really, to the question of is it possible, we spend a lot of time thinking about the tech because we want the projects to actually be, even if they're outrageous, to be realistic or realizable. So I, went really quickly through a lot of things that actually we have figured out in terms of like what size barrel you need and how many you need and how they, work with gravity and what's in what and things like that, which I find to be fairly boring and can't quite always remember because I don't want to. But they, it figures very prominently, and certain arguments of, well, it would look better if we did this. Well, we can't do that because it wouldn't work. So we do that a lot. But it's also very flexible, usually the tech. So it can usually kind of shoehorn into lots of different possibilities. So we definitely make design decisions that are completely design decisions based on what we're trying to achieve in terms of space and form and independent of tech. So, and then the second question was graphic representation. We are the highest form of compliment toward your previous comment in my view is cute. Like that's what I'm going for, cute. Not beautiful, but cute, and but beautiful, cute. And so I think we're trying always to kind of to take the diagram really seriously, to really work the figure and out, and to do it through certain drawing types like section and axon, and models. And then there is this kind of small movement in Chicago of kind of like-minded people that are sort of sort of making like a kind of a conversation about this kind of sort of graphic style. So we're kind of in a smaller, or a part of a conversation, graphic conversation that's happening, I think. It's not unrelated to what's happening everywhere else, but because we're in Chicago and we're kind of together, we look at everybody's stuff and they look at our stuff, and it kind of goes back and forth. So yeah, we're always thinking about the design in terms of how it's represented.
I think the representation, if I just kind of make additional comment, maybe while some other person comes up with a question from the audience, is I think the representation also kind of is about actually communication and how you kind of think about your role as a maybe architect, as a, I don't know, somebody that can mediate the public and maybe what's going to actually happen to the city. So I think there's that aspect, but kind of beyond the axons and diagrams, and maybe I think you call it cuteness of the drawings, I think I could also see some sort of reference or connection to the projects from the past. I think you mentioned the megastructure project from 50s or 60s, and you know, there's an interesting kind of almost like homage to Super Studios projects, or I saw the, I think Khan's transportation diagram, where you kind of take that and you have a play on it, so you turn that into a waterfall diagram instead of, you know, transportation. So I think there's kind of rather, I don't know, like maybe communication at multiple levels with the public, and but also within the display.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, we're definitely looking at past projects in order to kind of trigger in other architects and designers the kind of instant identification of where the project kind of sits in the discipline and the history of the discipline. And I mean, we are literally trying to recuperate the megastructure project, which, you know, megastructure is kind of a bad word, but our take is that it could be interesting if it's of certain things, like it could be the way for architects to re-engage in the design of the city when you have infrastructures that can get leveraged. Instead of doing the kind of infrastructure project from the 50s and 60s, which layered on a new infrastructure on top of old infrastructure. So not Yona Friedman, where he like makes a whole space frame, like no space frames, a space frame on top, you know, new transportation on top of old transportation. Not to do that, but just kind of like just thicken what's there and figure out a way to be more site specific, to introduce more difference, to introduce more possibilities of figure and form, and that's kind of what we're doing in studio too, is trying to kind of do that, like sort of how far can you push the figure of the urban scaled architecture, that it's not recognizable as a figure at the large scale, and then when you zoom in, is it a field, and then when you zoom in even more, is it a figure again on the interior? So yeah, we're definitely engaging in that, and the more like, kind of the more as sort of, I think we try to make projects that we do kind of explain projects slightly differently for people who aren't architects, but we're definitely interested in having a conversation within the discipline about what's possible.
Hi, thanks for sharing. Could you share with us your opinion about circles?
Circles?
Circles.
I love circles. I love circles. They are so perfect. I'm a little bit worried because the LA house we're going to do ovals, and I don't know if it's going to work. I'm really stressed. It looks good in real life, but it looks stupid in the drawings to me. Like, I don't know. But we keep doing circles, and so we decided we should try, I didn't decide that we should try something different, but somebody decided that we've done too many circles and we should do something different. So we tried ellipses or ovals, and they look pretty good. But I think maybe because, compositionally in opposition to the kind of sort of simple volumes that we're often making, I think there should always be a kind of, there should be some nuttiness and there should be some rules, and there needs to be a balance. And so the circle kind of maybe mediates between the two. It can also do landscape really well. It can produce effects when it gets bent that, when we do it on a perforated and corrugated facade, it produces effects that you maybe aren't, that are kind of surprising. And then they're just really cute. Yeah?
Gisela.
It's really beautiful work, great to see. I have a question. You talked about being obsessed with a public-private relationship, and that's, in building houses, that's a big theme, obviously. But I was fascinated seeing your projects with the views that you generate, the views, and the views, they don't always go outside, but they go back on yourself or back onto yourself. And I think it's funny that you mentioned the circles, because I think your circles and the mounds generate that opportunity to have views, but then go back on that go back onto themselves. And you generate that not only in the single houses, but also in the urban projects with the public spaces that are interiorized, and then also in that last house that you showed, or the second to last, where you have that big mound that generates that flip back onto itself. Did you ever think about that? Is that something conscious, or does it have to do with the circles, you think, or did it happen?
No, I guess maybe what we try we are usually experimenting with pretty simple moves to see to control the moves really, to really control the moves, we only do simple moves usually, and then can test their effects rather than doing something super complicated and then thinking about what happened. So maybe it's just a kind of function of that approach that then allows us to kind of tease those things out, but I don't know.
I think you work a lot with the circle and the donut, and sometimes the donut is a square or a kind of it's a courtyard or extrusion, but in a way it works as a circle too. Mm-hmm. It kind of creates that return. Mm-hmm. And the project in which you layer this spiral line over the circle, the field with circles. I don't remember the name of the project that has the islands. The free water. So the free water also works where the line work works in circular manners, kind of returning the view to itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did struggle a lot with that shape actually, because it was different in a couple of iterations, and we finally realized that it needed to actually be a square logic that does folding or circulating around, and that if it wasn't square enough, it would not be it wouldn't work right. It wouldn't look good and wouldn't be correct. It wouldn't be what we wanted.
Yeah, so, hi. I'm still really fascinated by your use of these platonic geometries, and I'm just kind of wondering if, it could be all of these things, but how are you making the decisions to use these geometries? So are you like looking really specifically at like the performative effects of these geometries, or is it really largely about legibility? Like I'm thinking about the project that you have for the post-industrial areas, how you use these rectilinear forms for the educational space on top, and then the circular mounds. So how did you make the decision that, you know, one, like it creates a really clear dichotomy, but why is one the other? And then also I'm wondering about the project right off the Chicago lakefront in Lake Michigan, and you have it's essentially a rectangle with circles inside. So I'm wondering, like, what is the effect of having the circles, and what's the non-circle space on that, and like to what extent do you consider the performance of the geometry?
I think a lot of the time it's as a contrast to the landscape, even though the landscape is completely constructed as well and is also platonic. The effect of the materiality of the landscape will be different, will make it different than the architecture, or in fact the landscape is also architecture, but so I think we're playing with legibility and control at the same time, so we can control effects and that the effects are legible. In the filter island, we actually sort of modulated the edge condition as well with more platonic shapes, but that would start to that the figure would start to be a little bit more complex, at least in plan, because it was so flat, really, because at that scale it has zero section, really. Like we tried to draw a section and then it's like nothing. So, you know, we had to redirect the effects toward the edge and legibility of the whole. So kind of the relationship of what it is to be at one point and then what it is to kind of read it as a whole. So I think for both reasons, both legibility and control, we do that.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank
Amazing.
You.
The legibility and the control is the perfect